You are standing at the meat case. The New York strip steaks are $18 a pound. Right beside them, in a vacuum bag, sits the whole strip loin for about $7. Same animal, same muscle, half the price. I found out I could pocket $75 on a single tray of steaks just by making 4 cuts in my own kitchen. Same beef the butcher sells you. And the deeper I dug into why almost nobody does this anymore, the more it looked like somebody wanted it that way. By the end, I'll show you a document from 1967 that explains exactly when the knife was taken out of your hands, and a trimming trick from an old home economics bulletin that turns the scraps into money too. You don't need a special knife or a cold room. You need a cutting board and about 10 minutes. Here's the thing that started all of this for me. I was in a warehouse store outside Columbus, and I watched a man in an apron wheel out a cart of those same vacuum-sealed loins and drop them in a bin. Then I turned around, and the identical meat, sliced, was on a tray for more than double. I stood there holding both, and I could not for the life of me figure out what I was paying extra for. So I bought the whole loin, I took it home, I put a cheap knife to it on my kitchen counter, and 10 minutes later I had a stack of steaks thicker and better looking than anything in that case, plus a bag of trimmings, and I'd saved enough to buy a second dinner. That should have been the end of it. A nice little win, but it nagged at me, because if it's this easy and the savings are this big, why did my mother buy pre-cut steaks? Why did her mother? When exactly did we all stop doing something our grandparents did without thinking? That question sent me down a hole I did not climb out of for weeks, and what I found at the bottom of it made me angry in a quiet, slow-burning way, because this wasn't an accident. It wasn't that people forgot. Somebody made a decision in a specific decade for a specific reason, and you and I have been paying for it every single week since. Let me start where I started, with the price itself, because the price is the first clue, and it makes no sense until you know the trick. A New York strip steak comes from one muscle. It runs along the back of the steer, and butchers call the whole thing a strip loin, or a shell loin, or a short loin, depending on how it's broken down. It is one long, lean piece of meat. When you buy a strip steak, you are buying a slice of that piece. Nothing more. The steak is not a different, fancier product. It is the loin, cut crosswise. So here is the part that stopped me cold. The store buys that whole loin, runs it under a band saw for about 30 seconds, lays the slices on a foam tray, wraps it in plastic, and then charges you somewhere between $10 and $13 extra a pound for those 30 seconds. I priced it out at 3 different stores near me. The whole strip loin ran between $6 and $8 a pound. The cut steaks from the very same case ran between $16 and $22. That is not a small markup. That is more than double, and sometimes triple, for a cut a child could make. A whole boneless strip loin weighs around 10 to 12 pounds before you touch it. Let's say you pay $7 a pound. That's around $77 for the loin. Cut into steaks and sold pre-packaged at $18 a pound, that same meat would cost you $180 or more. The difference is your $75 and then some. I've done this now more than a dozen times, and the gap has never once closed. But a number on a shelf doesn't tell you why. Therefore, I had to find out who decided that the cutting should happen in a plant 3 states away instead of at a counter in your own town. And that is where the trail got interesting. Because it wasn't always this way. Go back far enough, and every town had a butcher who broke down whole carcasses in the back. Before that, plenty of families bought a quarter or a side of beef and cut it themselves, or split it with neighbors. My grandfather did exactly that. Cutting your own meat wasn't a frugal hack. It was just Tuesday. I went looking for old home economics texts, the kind that were used to teach young women how to run a household in the early 1900s, and I kept finding the same thing. Detailed diagrams of the whole animal, instructions on which cuts came from where, advice on buying in bulk and breaking it down at home to stretch $1, There's a whole genre of United States Department of Agriculture farmers' bulletins from the 1920s that walk a homemaker through beef cuts like it's basic arithmetic, because to them it was knowing where a strip steak came from was considered ordinary knowledge, like knowing how to darn a sock or bake bread, so people used to know this. That's the first thing that hit me. This isn't secret information that was never discovered. This is common knowledge that was somehow unlearned across an entire country in about 2 generations. Things like that don't just evaporate. Something replaces them, and usually somebody profits from the replacement. That realization is what turned my little price comparison into a real hunt. Because if the knowledge was deliberately made unnecessary, then I wanted to know exactly who benefited when you and I stopped picking up the knife. So let me take you to the moment it changed. Because I found it, and it's more specific than I ever expected. For most of American history, meat was cut close to where it was eaten. A steer would be slaughtered and then shipped as hanging carcasses, whole sides of beef, in refrigerated rail cars and trucks. When it arrived at your town, a skilled butcher broke that carcass down into the cuts people wanted. That butcher was a craftsman. He knew the animal. He could look at a customer and cut exactly what they needed, as thick as they liked, and sell them the cheaper pieces too. Then came a company out of Iowa. In the 1960s, a firm called Iowa Beef Packers, later known as IBP, changed everything. In 1967, they pioneered something the industry now calls boxed beef. Instead of shipping whole hanging carcasses to your local butcher, they did the cutting themselves in enormous centralized plants, broke the animal down into primal and subprimal pieces, sealed those pieces in vacuum plastic, packed them in boxes, and shipped the boxes. On paper, it was efficiency. You ship less waste, less bone, less fat, riding the rails. It cut costs for the packer, but look at what it actually did to the knife. The skill moved. It left your town, and it moved into the plant. The local butcher, the man who knew the animal, slowly became unnecessary. Why keep a craftsman on staff when the meat shows up already broken down, already portioned, ready to slap on a tray? And that is the quiet turn. Once the cutting left your town, it left your hands too. The store didn't need to teach you anything. They just needed you to grab the tray and go. But boxed beef alone didn't finish the job. Therefore, I had to keep pulling, because there was a second change happening at the same time, right in the store where you shop, and it was aimed squarely at you. Go back to the supermarket itself. In the early days of grocery stores, meat was still a service counter. You walked up, you talked to a person, you asked for what you wanted, and he cut it for you right there. You could say, "Give me 4 strips, cut them thick, and watch it happen," and crucially, you could see the whole loin sitting there. You could ask the price of the whole thing. The knowledge was right in front of your eyes. Starting in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, stores made a deliberate switch to self-service meat cases, pre-cut, pre-wrapped, pre-priced. No person to talk to. New plastic film technology made it possible to wrap meat so it looked red and fresh under the lights. The industry pushed this hard because it was cheaper for them. One clerk restocking a case could replace several skilled butchers. Fewer questions, faster lines, more sales. And here's what got quietly buried in that switch. When the counter disappeared, so did the conversation. Nobody was there to tell you that the tray of 4 steaks in your hand was cut from a loin you could have bought whole for half. The wall between you and the whole cut wasn't made of brick. It was made of plastic wrap and a foam tray, and the simple fact that they stopped showing you the alternative. Now put the 2 changes together, because side by side, they tell the whole story. The cutting skill left your town in the 1960s with boxed beef, and the last person who could have explained any of it to you, the counter butcher, was being phased out at the same time. By the time both were done, an entire nation of people who used to cut their own meat had been turned into people who grab a tray and never ask a question. I want to be fair here. Nobody sat in a dark room twirling a mustache, but make no mistake about who profited. Every layer that got added between the animal and your plate is a layer that takes a cut of your money. The packer takes the cutting profit. The store takes the packaging profit. And you, standing at that case, pay for both, plus the convenience, plus the fact that you no longer know it's a choice. That gap, that $10 or $13 a pound, is the price of your own forgotten skill. And once I understood that, I couldn't unsee it. Every tray in that case started to look like a small toll booth. So I decided to stop paying the toll. And I want to show you exactly how, because it's easier than you think. Now here is where I know some of you are pulling back. You're thinking, that's fine for a man with a big kitchen and fancy knives, but I've got a small counter and one dull blade and no idea what I'm doing. I thought the same thing. I truly did. I am not a butcher. I have never worked a day in a meat department. The first loin I cut crooked, and it still came out better and cheaper than the stores. So let me walk you through it like the neighbor I am, with nothing but what you already have in a drawer right now. You need 3 things: a cutting board, a knife, any knife, though a longer one is easier, and about 10 minutes. That's the whole list. No saw, no special gear, no cold room, no skill you don't already have from cutting a roast or a chicken. If that question is already pulling at you the way it pulled at me, I want to point you towards something I put together called Meat Smart. It's a digital book where I laid out the full breakdown method, the trimming logic, and the pricing math in one place so you can take it to the store with you. There's also a wider system I built around this same idea, called the Full System, which connects the meat counter to every other place in your household budget where the same quiet toll is being collected. You won't find it on a shelf. It's in the description below, and it costs a lot less than one tray of pre-cut steaks. Now, with that in your back pocket, let me take you to the exact moment this all changed, because I found it, and it's more specific than I ever expected. Start at the store. Look for the whole strip loin, sometimes labeled strip loin, shell loin, or boneless short loin, usually in a heavy vacuum-sealed bag in the case or in a bin near the case. If you don't see it, ask. This is the part people skip, and it's the most important sentence in this whole video. Walk up to the meat department and say, "Do you sell whole strip loins in the bag?" 9 times out of 10 they do, in the back, and they'll bring one out. The one time they don't, a warehouse club almost always will. Bring it home. Open the bag over the sink, because there's liquid, and that red liquid is not blood, it's just water and protein, perfectly normal. Pat the loin dry with paper towels. Lay it on your board. Now look at it. One side has a thick layer of white fat. That's the fat cap. One long edge has a thinner, looser strip of meat and fat hanging off. Butchers call that the tail. And running along part of it, you may see a thin, silvery, tough membrane. That's the silver skin. You don't have to get any of this perfect. You're not on television. You're feeding your family. Here's the trimming. Slide your knife under the silver skin at one end, angle the blade slightly up toward the fat, and pull it off in strips. It comes away easy once you start. Trim the fat cap down to about 1/4 inch. You want some fat for flavor, not a slab of it. Don't throw those trimmings out, and I'll tell you why in a minute, because that's the part the old bulletin taught me, and it's better than the steaks. Then cut off that loose tail piece and set it aside. Now the main event, and it's almost embarrassingly simple. Turn the loin so it's lying long in front of you. Decide how thick you want your steaks. Steakhouse thick is about 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 inches. Slice straight down, crosswise, spacing your cuts. That's it. That is the entire secret that costs you $75 every time you don't do it. A 10 to 12 pound loin gives you roughly 12 to 14 thick steaks, depending on how you cut them. Wrap them individually or in pairs, in plastic and then a freezer bag. Press the air out and freeze what you won't eat this week. They keep beautifully. You just turned one $77 purchase into 2 or 3 weeks of steak dinners at a price the store would laugh at. And if your first cuts come out uneven, thicker on one end, thinner on the other, so what? Cook the thin ones a little less. Nobody at your table has ever complained that a free extra $75 made their steak the wrong shape. I promise you that. So the method works, and it works with a kitchen knife and no experience. But I told you the trimmings were the real lesson, and that's where the trail led me to the piece I least expected, the piece somebody worked to keep alive. Because as I dug through those old home economics texts, I noticed the writers treated the trimmings as the whole point. To them, throwing away fat and scraps wasn't just wasteful, it was almost shameful. And that told me these people understood something about that loin that we've completely lost. The steaks weren't the prize. The whole animal was the prize, and they used every ounce of it. Let me tell you what I do now with the parts the store throws away, or rather, sells back to you as another product. That tail piece you cut off? Slice it into strips across the grain and you've got stir-fried beef, or sandwich steak, or the makings of a beef and pepper skillet. The store sells that exact meat as sandwich steaks or stir-fry strips at a premium. You got it free. Inside the loin you already bought. The trimmings with good meat on them, into a bag in the freezer they go, and when I've saved up enough, I grind them, or I have the store grind them, into hamburger from the same premium loin. Do you understand what that is? That's strip steak hamburger. You cannot buy ground beef that good at any price, and it came out of the scraps. And the fat, the clean white fat you trimmed off the cap, this is the part from the old bulletins that genuinely changed how I cook. You render it, you cut it small, put it in a pan on low heat, let it slowly melt down over half an hour or so, and strain the liquid into a jar. What you get is beef tallow, clean, pure, shelf-stable cooking fat that our grandparents treasured. It makes the best roast potatoes and fried eggs you've ever had. It keeps for months, and people are paying real money for jarred tallow in fancy shops right now. You made it from garbage, from the part you were about to throw away. So think about what's actually happened here. The store sold you a whole loin at $7 a pound, and inside that one purchase was steaks, stir-fry meat, premium hamburger, and cooking fat, 4 products, and they'd have sold you every one of them separately at a markup. The old techs knew this. They built entire household budgets around it. That knowledge didn't die of natural causes. It was made to seem old-fashioned, replaced by convenience, until a whole generation believed the fat was trash. But I promised you a specific document, the last piece of evidence, and I want to give it to you now because it's the thing that finally made all of this click into place for me. I kept coming back to those United States Department of Agriculture farmers' bulletins from the early 20th century, the ones written to teach ordinary households how to handle meat. There's a whole series of them from the 1920s and 1930s, government documents printed by the millions that lay out the entire logic of buying meat in large pieces and breaking it down at home. One line of thinking in them stopped me cold. They didn't frame home cutting as a way to save a few pennies. They framed it as basic economic self-defense for a household. The bulletin's whole premise was that a family that understood the cuts could never be overcharged because they knew exactly what they were looking at. Read that again. A family that understands the cuts cannot be overcharged. That was considered essential household knowledge, printed and mailed out by the government less than 100 years ago. And then, within about 40 years, boxed beef in 1967 and the self-service case combined to make that exact knowledge feel unnecessary. Not wrong, just unnecessary. And unnecessary knowledge is the easiest kind to erase, because nobody fights to keep it. They just quietly stop teaching it, and one day it's gone, and the tray on the foam is all anybody remembers. Here's the secret finale, the thing those old bulletins understood that almost nobody talks about today. It is not really about strip steaks. Strip steaks are just the clearest example. The real lost knowledge is this simple rule, and I want you to carry it out of here. The closer you buy to the whole animal, the less you pay for someone else's knife. Every cut, every trim, every wrap, every foam tray is a service you are paying for, and most of them are services you can do yourself in 10 minutes with a kitchen knife. The strip loin is the easiest place to start because it needs almost no skill and the savings are enormous, But the same rule works on pork loins, on whole chickens, on brisket, on nearly everything in that case. And there's one more thing hidden in those old documents that I have to tell you, because it's the detail that proves how completely we were talked out of this. When you buy that whole loin and take it home, you can do something the store almost never does for you. You can let it age, take a few of your steaks, set them uncovered on a rack over a plate in the back of your refrigerator for 3 to 5 days before you cook them. The cold, dry air does what those old butchers did in their coolers. The surface dries, the enzymes inside the meat go to work, and the flavor deepens and concentrates into something that tastes like a steakhouse charged you $60 for it. That aging is a service restaurants and specialty butchers charge a fortune for. It costs you a rack, a plate, and patience. The knowledge was never complicated. It was just moved somewhere you'd have to pay to reach it. That's the whole trail. It started with me holding 2 pieces of the same beef at 2 wildly different prices in a warehouse in Ohio, and it ended in a stack of government bulletins that treated cutting your own meat as a basic right of a household that refuses to be cheated. The method was never lost because it stopped working. It was set aside because it worked too well for the people who profit from doing it for you. And somewhere along the line, a few old texts and a few stubborn grandparents kept the record alive long enough for you and me to find it again. So the next time you stand at that meat case, I hope you feel what I feel now. Not helplessness, a choice. Every tray on that foam is a small toll, and you just found the road around it. You're the kind of person who already suspected that a lot of what we call convenience is really just someone charging you for something you could do yourself. You were right. You've been right the whole time. This is proof. Now I want to hear from you. Go back to that warehouse moment I described, the 2 prices side by side. When did you last stand at a meat counter and feel like something didn't add up? And here's my real question, the one I want you to answer in the comments below. Did your parents or grandparents ever buy a side of beef or cut their own meat, and did they ever teach you how? Tell me. Type it out down in the comments, because I read them and I'm building a picture of exactly when this knowledge got taken from us, town by town. And tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far this reached. If you felt that click today, that feeling of getting back something that was quietly taken, then follow along, because that's the whole reason this exists. We are a group of people walking the trail back to the simple, honest methods that got buried to protect somebody else's profit, and we recover them one at a time. Next time I'm pulling the thread on the whole chicken, and specifically on why the pre-cut pieces cost more than the entire bird, and what the parts they throw in the trash are actually worth. I found something in an old poultry bulletin about the back and the carcass that I could not believe. Stick with me, and I'll bring it back for you, the same way I brought back the knife. Now, this video showed you the idea, but inside the old ways society, I take you all the way through the full at-home strip loin breakdown, cut by cut. And if you get stuck, you can ask me your own question, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You won't be doing this alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can cancel anytime.